For those of you who I've not met before, I'm Emily. I live in what I call the Bronx, but most other people who are from New York would not call the Bronx. I live in Riverdale, which is like a nice Jewish suburb within the Bronx. But I feel like I get to use the title Bronx. It's like that's where my zip code is. But I'm originally from South Florida, so that's kind of where my love of not only my grandparents but almost everyone's grandparents has come from. And that's where I spend my time connecting with my family member, extended family. And it was really in college when I went to college in Pennsylvania, and I was calling my grandparents all the time. And I noticed down the street, there's a nursing home. My grandparents actually never lived in a nursing home, but I figured, where would I find more people who would be more like my grandparents? I wanted to hang out with older people in college, much to the disappointment of my freshman friends. And so I spent 3 days a week for 4 years at the Phoebe home in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I said, I want to hang out with all the people here. It's a medium-sized nursing home. And there's about 400 people, 2 of whom were Jewish. So I first hung out with the Jewish residents, and then I got to meet all kinds of people. And finally, one of the chaplains who worked there, Reverend Albert Martin, he's a very long beard, and he is, I think, Presbyterian. And he had me sit down next to him, and he said, I noticed that you're only speaking to people who can speak in the way that you can. And I said, what? I mean, yeah, of course, I wouldn't want to speak to someone who doesn't speak the language I'm speaking. Like, I feel like that would be very hard. And he said, have you ever tried speaking with someone whose communication is quite different than yours? And I was still not catching what he meant. And that day was the first of many, that I sat down next to somebody suffering with dementia and Alzheimer's. And this is like a serious, horrific disease that is affecting so many loved ones near and far, but it's less, not glamorous, but there's less of a survival narrative that you'd see when people are undergoing cancer. There's something that when people are suffering from cancer, they're so brave, they're fighting so hard, but Alzheimer's is like a slowly deteriorating kind of disease. And it totally, over time, whether very slowly or very aggressively, compromises many parts of one's memory and speech and capabilities. I'm sure we all know someone or know of someone who is suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia. The two are different, but they overlap in a lot of traits. And I met someone there who was let me get this right, the wife of my grandfather's best man at his wedding. My grandfather said, if you're going to go to college in Allentown, Pennsylvania, you must meet my friend Stan, which I was a little judgy that my grandpa had more friends in college, like in my college town, than I had ever made. But as soon as I moved in, I walked down the street, and that's the first person I met. Her name was Lois, Aliyah HaShalom. She passed away in 2014, and she had frontal temporal dementia. And that's how I learned to communicate with someone who had no means of communicating verbally. And through a variety of different ways, it was really challenging many times, but we actually found some kind of lingo that gave us this feeling of connection and presence. And it filled me and nourished me in ways I'd never felt or experienced before. And I was thinking, the only thing that's missing here is Torah. The Torah of Alzheimer's, the Torah of dementia, the Torah of communicating with people differently. And weirdly, like the Bible, Tanakh, Jewish sources don't have so much to say about people whose memory is compromised, for people who are deteriorating in mental capacities, and people who we feel like they're losing themselves, and we're losing them in return. And we're suffering with that. And I was so shocked that Torah had nothing to say about that. Even like the closest examples we see are like Isaac in the book of Genesis was blind. We have people who had physical disabilities, but we don't really have so many images of people in our own Jewish history who are suffering from memory loss. And while there's so much research dedicated to trying to fix this problem and ideally find a cure, it's still so prevalent today in the ways that we see those we love, who we feel are becoming less and less present the way they usually were. So I feel like there should be Torah for this. And luckily, there's enough text out there in the world to help fill in those gaps. So we're a small group here. I would encourage you to share, cut me off, interrupt as many times as you can with ideas, questions, but more importantly, stories of those who who this kind of Torah can represent and connect with. So in order to find the best, I had to look wide and far to find Torah about this, but I'm pretty relentless in this project. So the first text that I wanted to look at, which I can share actually with you, is from the Mishnah Torah, which is right here. It might be a little hard to see. I can make it bigger. Here we go. Let me figure out how. Just expand this. It's funny, they teach you a lot of stuff in rabbinical school, but not tech, which unfortunately I'd really like to know now.
We can see it all right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Perfect. Amazing. So this text here is from the Mishnah Torah, which is a compilation of Jewish law written by Rambam or Maimonides. Maimonides, a few facts about this person. Very rational guy. He likes philosophy. He created the Mishnah Torah, which is just laws after laws after laws, which complement bodies of rabbinic literature that tell us what to do, what not to do. And so he's a very clear-cut rationalist. He thinks God is up there, and none of us will ever truly know what God is like. Doesn't really get too vulnerable. Doesn't get so. He's just very clear-cut, very straightforward, and one of the most important thinkers of Jewish law in Jewish tradition. So here he has a variety of texts in the Mishnah Torah that look at different areas and categories of Jewish law. So this is all under the category of halachot gzela ve'aveda, the laws of theft and lost property. Literally what is called hashavat aveda, returning lost property, is literally lost and found of Jewish law. It's funny, when I lived in Montreal for a year, there was an unofficial famous Chasidic community is in an area called Outremont, which is kind of where the Eruv is in Montreal. And it's a huge community. Montreal is like one of the largest Chasidic communities in North America, which I had not known until I married a Canadian who told me all of these things. And in Montreal, there was a huge sect of the Ger Chasidim, Bobov, Satmar, and New Square. Like there was many different clusters of Chasidic communities, but as soon as you enter the community, how would you know? Besides like certain physical appearances and a few kosher stores, there were signs on different trees, like stapled onto trees that said Hashava Saveda, looking for lost dog, or Hashava Saveda opportunity, looking for my mother-in-law's necklace. That was the only description of it. You're supposed to know who that was, whose mother-in-law it was, and what her necklace looked like. I found it slightly ineffective as an outsider to the community, but it clearly worked because every time I would go, I would see different Hashava Saveda opportunities to return random objects. Once it was like Yosel's notebook or like Mendel's kippah, like really tiny things. But it really reflected the tight-knit community of people looking for each other's lost items, but more importantly, they were fulfilling a mitzvah. Hashavat Aveda, here in Rambam text, Hashavat Aveda l'Yisrael mitzvat aseh, it's a positive mitzvah that you must do. Shene emar, Hashev tashivim. This is cited in Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, which the Mishnah Torah loves to do, to explain a rule that we must do, and citing a pasuk, a verse in the Torah that tells us how. It says, Hashev tashivim is you will return them. Them is referring to prized possessions in the time of the Torah, so like an ox or a goat or a wild cow. These are things that you might want to return to people. It said, Veharo'eh avedat Yisrael venit alem mimena vehenicha over below ta'aseh shne'emar lo tir'eh et shor achicha. You must not withhold the ox, literally the ox, from your brother. So this is particular for the Jewish community. Achicha meaning your fellow Jew. You cannot withhold things that belong to your fellow Jew. All of this, I'm just making sure there are no questions or thoughts. Does everyone still see this right here in front of us? the
Emily,
Hashavat Aveda?
we're actually looking at Likutei Maharan.
Oh no,
I think
this whole time.
another window. Sorry, I didn't realize.
I'm so sorry. Well, you didn't really miss very much. I was just reading one line. Let me see. It might not even be worth it, to be honest, to find here. How about now? Is this better?
Yes, that's it.
There it is. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so right here, all I quoted was Hashavat Aveda L'Yisrael Mitzvat Taseh, and then the reference is Hashev Tashivim right here. You must return those items to those who have you lost, referring to a Jewish person. So yeah, you must not withhold an ox from someone. This is the extent of the rules of Hashavat Aveda. And I said, great. These are rules relating to something that, okay, so if I see another announcement in Uchaman, I'll be sure to return to look for that which someone has lost, but this is clearly referring to things. And something that got me thinking about it was like, what other kinds of things are we able to return? And I was thinking there must be a bigger scope on that which is relating to the Mishnah Torah. There must be a more personal, a more vulnerable, a more spiritually moving connection to this kind of rule. So here's where I turn, which you already got a sneak peek of because of my tech error. This is where I turn to the work of Chasidic masters to help fill in some of these, not to fill in the gaps per se, but to add some extra Torah to what we're talking about here. So this, right? Oh, okay, we have a question from Deborah.
So I was thinking, I don't know, I haven't thought about this in years, but when I was thinking about the ox that needs to be returned, I was thinking, it does seem to me strange that the Torah doesn't have any stories about people who are suffering from memory loss and dementia, but I was thinking along returning something, and my daughter and I, it's over 30 years ago, but we were in a park, a local county park, and this man was walking up to us and saying, "Do you know where I live? Do you know where I live?" And he was so worried and so sad. And this is back when they still had phone booths, and we were near the phone booth, but I didn't think he had the wherewithal to know his number. So I went over to the phone booth and I called the police and I said, "I have this very nice older man," and I described him, and he looked so nice. I knew he must belong to somebody. He was well dressed, and he was very confused. And the police asked if we could just stay there, that his wife was desperately looking for him, and could we just stay there just to make sure he didn't wander off again, just so they could get there and pick him up. And so how much is it more important that now I had a lot of things to do, but I stayed there and I waited the half hour with him because I couldn't let this man just wander around the duck pond wondering where he has to be. That must be scary as heck. So I think that along the line, we are given a lot of opportunities to bring back what is lost. And how much more so if it is to return an ox than it is to return a human being.
Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. First of all, the story is heartbreaking, but what you did was so beautiful. At my yeshiva, if you tell a story like that, we would all respond with psh, which is like shkoyach, like fabulous. That's also like the direction where I'm taking us right next, because we don't leave stories about returning oxen. We don't leave them in the context of an ox. That would really be a lost opportunity there. So thank you so much. So the perfect segue. Do you know the name of that person?
I
think you're muted.
I don't remember his name after all these years. I mean, it's been, my goodness, I think it's over, I don't know, it's well over, it's got to be at least 35 years ago. So I don't remember his name, but I could tell you what he looked like. I mean, I remember his face and how he was dressed, and and I remember it being such a beautiful day and the sun was shining, and yet for this poor man, he was just desperately trying to find home.
It's so heartbreaking, but it's also like just a very powerful image to think that like you stood there and waited for a half hour, even without knowing his name. Like we don't we don't often do that with people that we don't know.
Well,
And it's
I also
just
had a
like
little,
really,
I had an active 3-year-old with me who wanted to play, and the playground was right next to him. So we amused him for a little
perfect.
while. Yeah.
That's awesome. Those in both goals there. Amazing. So perfect. From what Deborah just shared, I want to take us to the text of Likutei Maharan, which is what you originally saw before. This is a text written by, well, inspired by the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. So this is where he was born. He died in Uman. So you might see people, you might see like the kippot that say na Nachman Neumann. That's an attribute to their beloved Rebbe who was buried in Uman. And Rabbi Nachman is a really famous Chasidic master he was actually one of the youngest Chasidic teachers of our time, and he is the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, who's the founder of what is believed to be the founder of Chassidut, which is like spirituality, thinking more about God and the immanent and all around us, thinking about brokenness and vulnerability. So it's a text, Chassidut is a body of literature I often turn to. And over here, this is Rabbi Nachman's take on Hashavat Aveta, returning the lost. He says here, you can all see, thumbs up. You can see where right here, Likutei Maharan, perfect. So it says here, you must know, Shesarich linsoa lehatzadik lachzor al avedato. A person must travel to the tzaddik, the righteous person, in order to look for that which he has lost. And if you look here at the word avedato, it sees that it translates this word as he has lost. And I want to give us the opportunity to translate this word as searching for his lostness, searching for anything that he might have lost. And now I want to skip down a little bit to right here. V'hashichacha hi bechinat aveta. Forgetting is an aspect of losing. Kmo shekaru rabotenu zichronan livracha, just like our rabbi is like zecher tzadik latova zl. He said, hashocheach oved. Someone who forgets is one who loses. So now our lostness is not just about a lost property or lost ox. It is now about a lost person. And that kind of person is one who often forgets. This is the closest I can find to Rabbi Nachman talking about somebody in a position of mental suffering and one of memory loss. So who's forgetting things often. So this is the kind of person that we're looking for. But it says that not all of us are supposed to search for lost objects, but rather the tzaddik. The tzaddik is like this righteous person in the community. Usually in this time would be considered like a rabbi, the head rebbe of a community. And this, it continues here, v'tzarich lachazor levakesh avedato. A person must search and seek that which he has lost, and that which he has lost, v'haveda shelo hi etzel hatzadik. That which he has lost is with the tzaddik, which means the tzaddik is the one who has the lostness. But there actually aren't so many rules for what a tzaddik needs. A tzaddik isn't necessarily defined, but it says, the tzaddik searches after that which a person loses until he finds it. And after he finds it, he searches and seeks after that which others have lost until he or she also finds that which they have lost. Eventually, the tzaddik finds what everyone in the world has lost. So something that I like about first in this order of the things that we've learned so far is that Hashavat Aveda opens up the idea of returning lost objects into a category within Jewish law. It becomes a halachic reality that suddenly we're thinking about returning items. But also more importantly, Rabbi Nachman gives this through Likutei Maharan, this text here, Rabbi Nachman opens that up a little bit to consider that searching for lostness can be a value that is like a Jewish value in itself, but also a holy task. And the moments in which there's a certain moment, I actually don't know the medical term for it, but I've spoken to a number of people who have, sorry, I'm trying to unshare this screen so I can see everyone again. Hold on. Oh, here we go. Perfect. So there's this moment when you find that which somebody who's struggling with Alzheimer's has lost. There's a point when one is suffering through Alzheimer's or dementia or memory loss issues. I don't know the medical term for it, but they essentially have this brief moment where they're happier, they're lighter. It's usually actually towards the end of their lives. This happened to a few grandparents that I know, including my own. And they start telling stories, they'll dance, they feel lighter. And it could just be like numbers of medications that are in their body, or it could just be like towards the end. But there's this brief moment where you can actually feel or sense that which someone, like a brief memory that they might have had. So I want you in this moment to think about someone in your life who might have suffered or is currently suffering with Alzheimer's or dementia or memory loss, and think about a moment when they remembered something that you were not expecting them to remember. Think about something that you said, a story that you told, telling them about your children or your siblings or stories of their own lives, and the moment where there's a glimmer of familiarity comes into their face and says, oh, right. It happened to my husband's grandfather, alav shalom, once when he would sit down. He was a very religious man, and he would sit at the table and ask his children who went to Jewish day school and his grandchildren who went to Jewish day school and said, how's school? This man had complete dementia. And they said, it's good. He said, are you learning Tosafos? Are you learning the text of the Tosafot, which like these esteemed rabbis? And they're all like, yes, Sadie, we are. And you could just, for a minute, you could see his face beam. You could see like light entering his whole face. And it clearly connected him to a place of his own youth, his own time studying at a yeshiva, his own time living in a Jewish shtetl in Montreal. And for a moment there, what you've done as the person who just simply said, yes, I do learn the Tosafos, or yes, I do remember that. Or if you said, tell me about this moment in your life, what you're doing is filling in that lostness that person is suffering from. And while you're not restoring or you're not necessarily curing Alzheimer's, which is a very lofty goal and one that I think many of us pray for, you're fulfilling the mitzvah of Hashavat Aveda, of returning the lost. And there's one other form of therapy in a way that can do this even what feels more uncomfortable for us, but even quicker for that person. It's called, I think, like affirmation therapy or validation therapy. So if somebody who's suffering thinks that you are their spouse, thinks that you're their child, their long lost high school friend, their teacher, their own parent who passed away, then that could be a moment where you validating that person's experience is already restoring that lostness. So if you said, go find me my mother, and if you say, yes, of course I will, rather than saying your mother died many, many years ago, both of those things that you choose to do in that moment are restoring a loss and bridging this kind of meaningful connection in that moment. I want to respond to the comment from, I think her name's Reba. So sometimes people with dementia do not even realize they have memory loss. 100% true. So many times people suffering with dementia, the people who suffer way more than people suffering from memory loss are the loved ones who have their memories perfectly intact and are experiencing the harsh reactions of them not recognizing their names or themselves anymore. So sometimes returning a lost object, fulfilling the mitzvah of Hashavat Aveda, might not be for the one who lost it, but for the one who misses the time when that person had that thing they lost. Like finding that necklace for that mother-in-law in Outremont, Montreal, might not be for the betterment of that woman, but might be for the betterment of me when I picture what that mother-in-law looks like when she wears it. So sometimes, and that's a really important thing to remember, that they're not necessarily suffering the ways that we suffer when we see people struggling with memory loss, but when we take the opportunity to remind them or to fill in the gaps of that which they have forgotten or lost, while it is probably painstaking, requires a ton of patience, repeating yourself every 5 minutes, or even changing characters in the story of their lives, you're doing a holy task. You're doing this really important work of communicating with people in the ways that they know how to communicate now. More importantly, you're fulfilling a mitzvah that we didn't even know could apply to human beings. This really puts returning an ox in a whole different perspective, thinking not that this is not just an opportunity we have, but an obligation we have. And thinking about that as we go forward, especially during these really troubling times of COVID, where those we love who are struggling with memory loss might be in nursing homes, or who might just be away and can't take visitors right now. Both for them and for you, finding those bridges of communication that may not be verbal might just restore some of the lostness that you feel during this horrific disease that can come and take things away. But it also can restore some of the lostness that you feel for missing them in the ways that they once were. So I think COVID is the best time to take out those old albums, to turn on old videos, to see pictures, and to talk to your grandparents or relatives and neighbors, friends who knew them at a time when their memory was sharp. Because in some of their own lostness, there's a chance for us, Hashavat Aveda, but also Hashavat like Avedenu, to return our lostness, returning the parts of us that we have lost in response to losing memories of our loved ones.